Kirschenbaum. I'm an undergraduate at the University of California, Berkeley. I study rhetoric with the concentration in gender and sexuality, queer theory, and critical animal studies. This semester, I spent the past semester studying bestiality and zoophilia, and discourses surrounding the topics and whether or not we could conclude that bestiality could be consensual. So I find bestiality really interesting because we as humans have taken over non-human animals for reasons of food, fur, pets, not too nice things, yet we still find having sex with animals very taboo. And I think it's really interesting also because other sexual taboos such as homosexuality, BDSM, trans individuals, the list goes on, they've been brought into light debatably, yet bestiality is still something we just do not talk about. And I commonly conflate it with necrophilia, incest, things that just people will not think about, shut off immediately. So I find that really interesting. I think we need to talk about it. So that's why I'm here. So yeah, we've seen, Leda and the Swan. This has been in Greek mythology. That other picture is really interesting. I find that on Tumblr, mixing animal products with nudity and saying if there's a sexualization with animal products. So I definitely think that this interspecies mingling is in our discourse. We just have chosen to push it aside, not really think about it. But before I get into detail, I want to talk about the difference between bestiality and zoophilia. Yesterday in the bestiality workshop, we saw a spectrum of bestiality, zoophilia, interspeciesism. But I want to make clear that bestiality is more of an act of interspecies sexuality, whereas zoophilia is an identity. I don't really believe that it's a spectrum, just because you get put into a box when you label things by what type of act you're into. This is something that queer theorists many times say, especially Judith Butler. But I find that zoophilia is an identity that you could call yourself or anyone who engages in interspecies sexuality of any kind. So companion species. Companion species is a theory that's really important to understand when grappling the bestiality discourse, just because companion species are humanized non-humans. Donna Haraway puts it really nicely in her Companion Species Manifesto, how we as humans basically take in non-humans, put them into our homes, feed them what we like, and we basically treat them like humans in order to gain some self-utility. And I think it's really important in bestiality because commonly the animals that are found in bestial relations are companion species. This can mean dogs, cats, horses, rabbits, whatever you want it to mean. So I deal a lot with Donna Haraway, Judith Butler, and Michel Foucault when I study bestiality. I think it's really important to remember that we define species, or I personally define species as a differentiation between the self and the other. Maybe these reasons of differentiation are because of biology, maybe it's societal, but it's really important to remember that all of this is defined by discourse. Sexuality is a web of discourse. It's not something that we as humans decide. It's like humanity and species and everyone input some thought into discourse, whether that be in media, literature, just talking. So it's really important to remember that I do not define zoophilia or bestiality or homosexuality or queerness. It's discourse. And so I think that when we do look at bestiality, it's important to remember that this is all because of discourse. And that's why I study rhetoric, because I love that. But to begin, communication is very necessary. And I think John did a good job at talking about how consent is necessary in any sexual relation, and consent comes with communication. I'm going to go later into detail on consent, but what I refer to as communication is the bottom, communication, and I do that to emphasize the two-sided necessity of communication, whereas communication with no hyphen kind of gives a unilateral approach, whereas you need to make sure to remember that communication is two or multi-sided. So when referring to bestiality, consent has to be from all parties, not just the human. So I find, or my big thesis for this paper is that public discourse surrounding interspecies sexuality, so zoophilia, bestiality, is often presented in condescending manners that place zoophilia and bestiality into a human, non-human, and consent rate paradigmatic binary, which further limits a queering of relationality and ultimate inclusion of interspecies sexuality within queer spaces and discourse. So throughout this presentation, I want you to remember that what I'm looking at are two different binaries, human, non-human, and consent and rape, or consent and abuse. So I think that bestiality is trying to fight these binaries and putting something in the middle. So what is queer? I didn't really know what the level of familiarity with queer theory is for this presentation, so I'm going to give a brief overview, but a queer identity is anti-assimilationist. So queer identities look for post-binary spaces. We try to fight the binaries of top-bottom, masculine-feminine, dom-sub, gay-straight, and the like, in order to not limit anybody by their sexuality. So I think it's really important to remember that bestiality does fall into this fighting of binaries. And so what I refer to is the act of queering. So queer is the identity, queering is the act. Queering is a very temporal act where we look for the longer picture of these breaking down of binaries. And so what I study is how kinship falls into the bestiality discourse. So kinship is what gives to relationality, which is how anybody relates to another. And I'm interested, can kinship become inclusive of human, non-human relationality? I draw from Judith Butler a lot on this. She finds that kinship practices will be those that emerge to address fundamental forms of human dependency. And it's interesting because she does use the word human, but it's not as if there are many theories on bestiality and kinship. So I do have to use my discretion and assume that she didn't really mean only humans, that she meant just beings. So just keep in mind that that's my discretion. But I think that if we included zoophilia in forms of kinship, that the politic of zoophilia will have to address some form of human relationality. And because kinship, from what Judith Butler and other theorists say, it's very normative in the fact that it is human. So I think that it's necessary to queer kinship to include bestiality. Because if we don't queer kinship, we're not going to get anything other than this human-human relationality. So it's important just to remember that I'm referring to the queering of relationality in order to examine bestiality with an unbiased view. And that's what in rhetoric we do. We don't choose sides as to say, oh, bestiality can or cannot be consensual. We're trying to look at discourse that surrounds bestiality to provide as much of an unbiased analysis as we can. And also, if we do queer kinship and we queer relationality, I think we're going to be able to find that we don't have to stick to these binaries of human, non-human, and consent rape that many people place on bestiality. So I think that it's super important to remember queering and temporal perspectives on kinship. So where do we find bestiality? It's actually interesting where you could find bestiality on the internet. I think you mentioned yesterday, when you Google, you have millions and millions of views. I like to look at images, not so much pornographic, because I think that's a different realm of bestiality. You could call this pornography, but there are a lot of images that allude to bestiality. There are a lot of videos that talk about bestiality, documentaries, and the like. And so that's what I choose to focus on, because I think that gives us a one-on-one interpretation of bestiality and accessibility. I don't like to only focus on academia just because it's not very accessible to all. So we will be looking at some videos today. Um,